What if the story of humanity did not begin where our history books tell us it did? What if the first civilization we recognize was not humanity's beginning, but its return? When we speak about origins, we often imagine a slow and uncertain ascent. Small groups learning to farm, crude tools evolving gradually into cities, symbols slowly becoming language. This is how history is supposed to unfold, carefully, incrementally, without sudden leaps. And yet, when the Sumerians appear in the archaeological record, they do not arrive as beginners. They arrive as if they already know what they are doing. In the lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, cities emerge with administrative systems, astronomy, mathematics, writing, medicine, law, and large-scale architecture already in place. Not hinted at, not experimental, fully operational, and that detail alone should make us pause. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where history refuses to behave the way we expect, consider subscribing. And if you're listening somewhere quiet tonight, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. The earliest Sumerian tablets do not read like the first attempts of a culture learning to record its thoughts. They read like records written by people who were already accustomed to organizing the world through symbols. These tablets catalog taxes, land boundaries, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, and legal decisions. They assume a society that already understands measurement, classification, and continuity. There is no visible period of confusion, no obvious learning curve preserved in clay, and that is where the discomfort begins. Because every other civilization we know shows its rough edges, Egypt leaves behind early hieroglyphs that shift and simplify over centuries. Chinese characters evolve from scratched symbols into complex systems across millennia. Even our own alphabet carries visible traces of trial, error, and adaptation. But Sumerian writing appears without ancestors. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known relatives, no clear lineage, and no surviving cousins. It stands alone in history, like a survivor whose family disappeared before anyone could remember their names. Languages do not behave this way. They are not invented overnight. They accumulate, they borrow, they mutate, and when entire language families vanish, they usually leave faint traces behind. Lone words, structural echoes, ghosts embedded in neighboring tongues. But Sumerian arrives already complete, already formalized, already capable of expressing abstraction, law, poetry, and technical instruction. If that were the only anomaly, it might be dismissed. Archaeology is incomplete. Evidence erodes. Time destroys more than it preserves. But the pattern repeats across every domain of Sumerian life. Their mathematics is not rudimentary. It is precise, built around a base 60 system that we still use today to measure time and angles. Their astronomical records track planetary cycles with accuracy that would normally require generations of observation. Their irrigation systems function from the start, requiring surveying, planning, and cooperation on a scale that usually emerges only after long periods of failure and refinement. And yet, beneath their cities, we do not find those failures. No collapsed prototypes, no abandoned systems showing mistakes, no gradual climb from simplicity to complexity. Instead, we find layers of occupations separated by silence, by flood silt, by interruptions that look less like progress and more like reset. This is not speculation. Excavations at sites like Shuruppak and Kish reveal thick layers of sterile clay separating earlier settlements from later ones. Above the clay, Sumerian civilization rises. Below it, another world existed, a different culture, buried suddenly completely and rebuilt upon. The Sumerians themselves were keenly aware of this division. Their texts speak of a time before and a time after. They do not describe invention, they describe restoration. Over and over again, the same phrasing appears in temple inscriptions and royal dedications. What was built was not new, but renewed, not created, but carried forward. That phrasing is easy to overlook. It sounds ceremonial, almost poetic, but repetition gives language weight. And when a civilization repeatedly insists that its foundations come from distant days, it suggests memory rather than myth. Memory, however, fades unevenly. When people survive catastrophe, they do not preserve everything. They preserve fragments, practices that work, systems that are useful, stories that explain why survival mattered. Over time, Explanations turn symbolic. Names change. Causes blur. But structure remains, and structure is harder to fake than belief. The Sumerians did not claim to be the first humans. They did not describe discovering writing, mathematics, or agriculture through experimentation. Instead, their texts often position knowledge as something received, passed down, remembered imperfectly, preserved, because it was already ancient by the time it was written. This creates an unsettling possibility. What if the reason Sumer appears fully formed is not because development happened faster than we expect, but because it happened earlier than we remember? What if the Sumerians were not pioneers standing at the dawn of civilization, but inheritors standing in the aftermath of something older? A civilization does not need to vanish completely to be forgotten. It only needs to lose continuity. Writing disappears, cities flood, specialists die, survivors adapt. And when memory outlasts explanation, history begins to sound like myth. And yet myths usually exaggerate. They glorify. They explain the world through gods acting without limits. Sumerian accounts are different. Their stories describe labor, fatigue, error, correction. Their gods argue. They make mistakes. They respond to consequences. These are not timeless beings shaping reality with a word. They behave more like administrators managing a system that can fail. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If Sumer was not humanity's beginning, then what exactly was it rebuilding? And why does the archaeological record go silent precisely where development should be loudest? Because once you notice this pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore. The writing that appears without parents, the mathematics that arrives without drafts, the cities that rise without rehearsal, together they suggest not a birth, but a return, not a beginning, but a restart. And if human history did restart with the Sumerians, then the question is no longer how civilization began. The question becomes, what ended it the first time? What if the Sumerians were not asking how to build a civilization, but how to rebuild one? What if the most important thing they inherited was not technology, but memory? When archaeologists first began excavating southern Mesopotamia in the late 19th century, they expected to find simple beginnings buried beneath later grandeur. That expectation shaped how discoveries were interpreted. Early layers were assumed to be primitive by default, later layers advanced by design. But the ground did not cooperate with the story. At several major Sumerian sites, excavation revealed something unexpected. Between two periods of human occupation lay thick layers of clean, sterile clay, not gradual sediment, not the slow accumulation of seasonal flooding, but sudden deposition. Mud laid down in a single overwhelming event. Below it, one culture. Above it, another. And between them, silence. This is where interpretation becomes fragile. Geologists and archaeologists agree that a major flood event struck Mesopotamia around the late 4th millennium BCE. It was not global, but within the river plains where Sumerian cities stood, it would have felt total. Fields drowned, settlements submerged, infrastructure erased. For people whose entire world existed between two rivers, this was not a local disaster. It was the end of everything they knew. And yet, when cities reappear above the flood layer, they do so with remarkable organization, not as scattered villages relearning agriculture, but as planned urban centers. Walls, canals, temples, and administrative districts appear as if the builders already understood the requirements of large-scale society. This is not how recovery usually looks. After known collapses, whether caused by drought, war, or plague, societies simplify before they grow again. Skills are lost, systems shrink, complexity takes time to return. We see this after the fall of Rome, when road maintenance disappears, literacy contracts and urban populations decline for centuries. We see it after the Bronze Age collapse, when writing vanishes across entire regions. But post-flood Sumer does not simplify. It consolidates. And the Sumerians themselves never describe this phase as innovation. Their texts speak of re-establishing order, restoring temples, remeasuring land, and reassigning roles. The language suggests continuity interrupted, not invention sparked. This distinction matters, because memory behaves differently from imagination. When people invent, they explain. When they remember, they preserve. Sumerian texts are filled with procedures rather than justifications, instructions rather than theories. They describe how things are done, not why they were first conceived. That tone is subtle but consistent. Their legal documents, for example, do not debate the nature of justice. They assume it. Their contracts rely on standardized measures that appear fully agreed upon. Their astronomical texts do not speculate about the sky. They record it. Over and over, the tablets imply that systems already existed before anyone thought to defend them philosophically. And then there is the king list. At first glance, it reads like mythology. Rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years, names repeated across cities long buried. But the structure of the document is strikingly bureaucratic. No stories, no drama, just names, cities, and reign lengths. And then a single dividing line. After the flood swept over, kingship was lowered from heaven again. Everything before that line follows one pattern. Everything after follows another. The reigns shorten dramatically. Cities change. Power reorganizes. The text itself treats the flood as a rupture in continuity, not as a symbolic event, a before and an after. And crucially, the list never explains the numbers. It simply preserves them. That preservation hints at something deeper. If the pre-flood section encoded information the later scribes no longer understood, copying it faithfully would have mattered more than interpreting it. This is how technical knowledge survives loss of context. The form is preserved even when meaning fades. Over time, precision outlasts explanation. We see similar behavior elsewhere. Medieval monks copied mathematical texts they could not fully apply. Ancient sailors navigated using star charts whose origins were already forgotten. Accuracy mattered because it worked, not because it was understood. The Sumerians may have been doing the same thing. Their base 60 mathematical system, for instance, appears without experimentation. No competing systems. No transition. Just immediate adoption across timekeeping, geometry, and astronomy. This is not how humans usually choose standards. Standards emerge through trial, conflict, and compromise. But in Sumer, the standard arrives already accepted. Why? One possibility is that it was inherited. A system already proven, already reliable. Passed down because abandoning it would break everything else built upon it. Once a civilization locks into a measurement system, changing it is costly. If Sumer inherited such a system, they would preserve it even without knowing its origin. And preservation is exactly what their texts emphasize. In scribal schools, students copied exercises labeled as ancient. Not authored, not discovered. Ancient. The phrase appears again and again from distant days. Not a metaphor for wisdom, but a marker of time beyond living memory. This creates an uncomfortable continuity between the archaeological flood layers and the textual insistence on restoration. The ground says something ended. The tablets say something was remembered. Together they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But memory is not neutral. When people inherit fragments of a broken world, they adapt them. They mythologize gaps. They personify forces they no longer control. Over generations, technical language becomes symbolic language. Administrators become gods. Leaders become divine. Causes become stories. This may explain why Sumerian myths feel strangely procedural. Their creation stories describe trial and error, failed attempts, adjustments. These are not traits of poetic imagination. They are the traits of problem-solving remembered imperfectly. If a pre-flood civilization possessed advanced knowledge and passed fragments of it to survivors, those fragments would not survive as textbooks. They would survive as rituals, stories, and systems that worked well enough to keep going. And that may be why Sumerian civilization feels simultaneously ancient and incomplete, as if it knows more than it can explain, as if it remembers something it cannot fully articulate. Because once you consider the possibility of inherited memory, many anomalies align. The sudden appearance, the missing developmental stages, the language isolate, the emphasis on restoration, the flood dividing time itself. None of this proves what came before, but it reframes what came after. Sumer no longer looks like a beginning. It looks like a threshold, a place where humanity crossed from forgetting into remembering, from survival into structure, from fragments into systems. And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer whether a civilization existed before Sumer. The question becomes how much of it survived, and in what form. Because the Sumerians did not just rebuild cities, they rebuilt order, law, time, measurement, and they did so as if following instructions left behind by a world that expected to be forgotten, and that leads us to a deeper uncertainty. If memory survived catastrophe once, then catastrophe is not the end of history. It is part of its rhythm. And that raises an unsettling thought. If human history restarted with the Sumerians, what does that say about the cycles we may still be part of? What if the greatest evidence of a forgotten world is not buried in ruins, but embedded in how the Sumerians understood time itself? What if the way they measured reality was inherited from an age that had already learned to watch the sky? Civilizations can forget many things. They can lose cities, languages, and even entire ways of life. But the way a culture measures time is one of the hardest systems to reinvent from nothing. Timekeeping demands consistency. It requires long observation, comparison, and correction. Errors compound quickly. A flawed calendar drifts. A faulty system collapses under its own inaccuracies. And yet, from their earliest records, the Sumerians used a mathematical structure so elegant that it remains embedded in modern life. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary conventions. They are practical solutions chosen by people who understood divisibility, cycles, and the need for precision. What makes this unsettling is not that the Sumerians used base 60. It is that they did so without hesitation. There is no evidence of alternative systems being tested and discarded, no trace of debate, no gradual refinement from simpler models. The system appears fully formed, standardized across cities, and applied consistently to trade, architecture, astronomy, and ritual. This kind of agreement normally takes generations. To choose a measurement system is to lock a civilization into a shared framework of reality. Once chosen, it shapes how people build, trade, and think. Changing it later becomes almost impossible without disrupting everything built upon it. The fact that Sumerian cities adopted the same system simultaneously suggests inheritance rather than invention, a framework already trusted, already proven. Their astronomical records deepen this impression. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus, the moon, and other celestial bodies with a precision that requires sustained observation over long periods. Patterns like planetary cycles cannot be identified in a single lifetime. They emerge only after decades, sometimes centuries of careful record-keeping. And yet, the earliest tablets already assume familiarity with these cycles. The observations are not framed as discoveries. They are logged, recorded, compared, as if the sky had been studied before, and the role of the scribe was to maintain continuity rather than to explore unknown territory. This distinction matters, because observation creates knowledge slowly, but maintenance preserves it quietly. A culture focused on preservation behaves differently from one driven by discovery. It values accuracy over explanation, consistency over experimentation, fidelity over innovation. This preservation mindset appears again in Sumerian education. Scribal schools trained students through repetition, copying ancient texts, memorizing standard forms, maintaining linguistic precision even after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. For centuries, scribes learned a language no one spoke at home anymore. Why preserve a dead language? Usually languages die because they lose relevance. They are replaced by something more useful. But Sumerian was preserved precisely because it was useful. It carried access to older knowledge, legal formulas, ritual instructions, astronomical records, administrative continuity. To abandon it would mean losing contact with something considered foundational. That reverence suggests the Sumerians understood themselves as caretakers rather than creators. Even their myths reinforce this role. The gods they describe are not distant creators of reality. They are managers, overseers, organizers. They assign tasks, they regulate labor, they distribute knowledge. These stories reflect a worldview where civilization is something maintained through effort, not conjured through miracle, and maintenance implies prior existence. Consider the flood narratives that echo across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later traditions. The flood is not portrayed as a cosmic beginning. It is portrayed as interruption, a disruption that nearly erased order. Survivors rebuild using knowledge preserved in fragments. Boats, seeds, animals, measurements, rituals, these are not inventions. They are salvaged tools. Across cultures, flood stories repeat the same structure. Warning, preservation, survival, rebuilding. What changes are the names and symbols. What remains constant is the idea that something valuable existed before the waters rose. This repetition does not prove a single global event, but it does suggest a shared human memory of disruption, of loss severe enough to divide time itself into before and after. And in Mesopotamia, that memory aligns with geological evidence, the mud beneath the cities, the silence between layers. If the flood represents a rupture in continuity, then Sumerian civilization may represent humanity's attempt to restore continuity, to reconnect with systems that once worked, to stabilize the world again. And restoration does not require full understanding. You do not need to know why a tool was designed the way it was to keep using it. You only need to know that it works. Over time, explanation fades. Ritual remains. Systems persist long after their origins are forgotten. This may explain why Sumerian texts are so precise and yet so restrained. They do not speculate wildly about origins. They do not proclaim themselves chosen. They simply record, as if accuracy itself were sacred. Because once you are rebuilding after collapse, accuracy becomes survival. An irrigation channel dug at the wrong angle floods fields or dries them out. A calendar misaligned with the seasons destroys crops. A legal system inconsistent across cities invites conflict. Precision is not philosophical. It is practical. And that practicality suggests experience. It suggests that mistakes had already been made somewhere else, sometime earlier, that lessons were learned at great cost, and that the fragments which survived were treated with care because repeating those mistakes was not an option. This interpretation does not require advanced lost technology or impossible civilizations. It requires only continuity interrupted by catastrophe, knowledge passed down unevenly, memory preserved without context, systems maintained long after their creators disappeared. In that light, Sumer becomes less mysterious and more tragic. A civilization standing on the ruins of something it cannot fully remember, doing its best to keep the world ordered with tools inherited from the past. And if that is true, then the Sumerians were not the authors of human history. They were its archivists. Which brings us to a more unsettling possibility. If humanity has already restarted once, then history may not be linear at all. It may be cyclical, periods of accumulation followed by disruption, memory narrowing, knowledge compressing, civilization rebooting. And if that cycle exists, then the question is not whether it can happen again. The question is whether we would recognize it if it did. What if the reason the Sumerians struggled to explain their own origins is because the knowledge they inherited was already incomplete? What if what survived the collapse was not understanding, but fragments that still worked? When we imagine a lost civilization, we often picture dramatic ruins, advanced machines, or technologies far beyond our own. But history rarely preserves things so cleanly. Collapse does not erase selectively. It removes specialists first. The people who understand why systems work disappear faster than the systems themselves. What remains are habits, procedures, and rituals whose original logic has faded. This is how complexity survives catastrophe. A calendar can endure even when the reasoning behind it is forgotten. A legal formula can be repeated long after the social conditions that shaped it have changed. A language can persist in ritual long after it stops being spoken in daily life. In each case, function outlives explanation. The Sumerians show signs of exactly this kind of survival. Their texts are meticulous but rarely philosophical. They tell us how to perform rituals, how to record transactions, how to track celestial movements. They rarely tell us why these systems came into being. Origins are hinted at but never fully explored, as if the scribes themselves no longer had access to the beginning of the story. This restraint is telling. Cultures inventing new systems tend to explain them. They justify, they argue, they mythologize their own genius. But cultures preserving inherited systems focus on accuracy. They repeat formulas carefully. They discourage deviation. Mistakes become dangerous not because they are wrong, but because no one remembers how to fix them. This mindset can be seen in how Sumerian scribes treated their texts. Errors were corrected meticulously. Copies were compared. Even when Sumerian ceased to be a living language, scribes continued to train in it for centuries. Bilingual dictionaries were created, not to replace Sumerian, but to preserve access to it. Knowledge was being conserved, not expanded. Why conserve something so rigorously if it were easily replaceable? The answer may lie in how fragile continuity truly is. A single generation without proper transmission can sever understanding permanently. Once the people who know why are gone, the people who know how become guardians of something they cannot fully explain. This may explain the tone of Sumerian creation narratives. Unlike later mythologies that describe creation as instantaneous and perfect, Sumerian accounts describe process, trial, error, adjustment, failed attempts that are repurposed rather than discarded. These stories do not read like symbolic poetry meant to inspire awe. They read like memories of problem-solving filtered through mythic language. When people lack scientific vocabulary, they reach for metaphor. Gods shape clay. Essences are mixed. Forms are tested. The language is symbolic, but the structure is procedural. Something was attempted, it did not work. It was adjusted. This is not how imagination usually behaves. It is how experience is remembered when its original context is lost. And yet, the Sumerians never claimed to fully understand these processes. They do not explain them, they preserve them. That distinction suggests humility rather than invention. Even their concept of kingship reflects this inherited mindset. Kings are not portrayed as absolute creators of order. They are stewards, appointed, charged with maintaining balance. Their legitimacy is derived from alignment with older decrees, not from personal innovation. Authority flows downward from something older, something established before their time. This idea appears again and again. Order existed before, was disrupted, and must now be maintained. Maintenance implies vulnerability. A world that must be constantly maintained is a world that has already broken once. The fear of collapse lingers beneath ritual. Precision becomes sacred. Change becomes dangerous. Innovation is approached cautiously, because deviation risks losing what little remains. This may explain why Sumerian civilization appears both advanced and conservative, technically sophisticated, yet deeply traditional, capable of remarkable feats, yet hesitant to depart from inherited forms. They were not exploring the unknown. They were protecting what survived, and protection shapes culture in subtle ways. It favors repetition over experimentation, stability over novelty, accuracy over creativity. Over time, this produces a civilization that looks fully formed, but emotionally burdened by memory. It cannot articulate. Because once you are rebuilding after catastrophe, you are always aware that the ground beneath you has failed before. This awareness may also explain why the Sumerians paid such attention to cosmic order. The movements of the sky offered predictability in a world that had proven unpredictable. Stars returned on schedule. Planets followed cycles. The heavens did not forget. Aligning society with celestial patterns may have felt like anchoring civilization to something more stable than the earth itself. If the flood erased cities, the sky remained, and so they measured it, tracked it, recorded it carefully. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of trust. The sky became a reference point for rebuilding time itself. When viewed this way, Sumerian civilization feels less like humanity's confident first step and more like a careful recovery. A society walking forward while constantly looking back. A culture that knows something was lost, even if it no longer knows exactly what. And this reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking whether the Sumerians invented civilization, we are forced to ask why they were so focused on preserving it. Why their texts emphasize continuity over creation, why their systems appear complete rather than exploratory. Because once you see civilization as something that can be lost, you stop treating it as inevitable, and that realization changes how history itself is written. If humanity has already experienced collapse severe enough to fracture memory, then progress is not guaranteed. It is conditional, fragile, dependent on transmission as much as invention. Which brings us to a final and uncomfortable reflection. If the Sumerians were rebuilding with fragments they barely understood, then how much of our own world rests on inherited systems we no longer fully comprehend? And if continuity breaks again, what will survive us? What if the most dangerous assumption we make about history is that it only moves forward? What if progress is not a permanent direction, but a temporary condition? The idea of linear progress is comforting. It suggests that once knowledge is gained, it remains secure, that each generation stands higher than the last. That collapse is an exception rather than a pattern, but when we look closely at the long arc of human history, stability appears far rarer than disruption. Civilizations rise, consolidate, fragment, and disappear. Writing systems vanish. Trade networks dissolve. Skills that once seemed indispensable become forgotten crafts. The past is filled with examples of societies that reached remarkable levels of organization only to lose them entirely. What makes the Sumerians different is not that they collapsed, but that they seem to have been acutely aware that collapse was possible. Their worldview reflects this awareness everywhere. In their myths, the gods fear disorder. In their laws, precision is emphasized over flexibility. In their architecture, alignment and repetition dominate. In their rituals, continuity matters more than innovation. These are not the habits of a civilization convinced of its permanence. They are the habits of a civilization that knows what it means to lose everything. This perspective reshapes how we interpret their relationship with time. Time, for the Sumerians, was not just a sequence of moments. It was a structure to be maintained. Calendars synchronized with celestial cycles, rituals repeated to stabilize seasons, records preserved to prevent drift. Time itself became something fragile, requiring care, because once continuity breaks, even time loses coherence. If agricultural cycles fall out of alignment, crops fail. If calendars drift, festivals lose meaning. If memory erodes, society forgets why it does what it does. The Sumerians seem to have understood this intuitively. Their obsession with record-keeping was not bureaucracy for its own sake. It was defense against forgetting, defense against repeating catastrophe. And yet, for all their precision, the Sumerians never claim certainty about the deep past. They preserve, but they do not explain. They remember that something existed before, but they do not claim to fully understand it. Their restraint stands in contrast to later cultures that confidently assign divine purpose to their own origins. This humility may be the most revealing feature of all. A civilization inventing itself tends to glorify its beginnings. A civilization inheriting fragments tends to treat origins cautiously, reverently, almost fearfully, because origins are tied to loss. The Sumerians did not write epics celebrating the birth of civilization. Their great narratives focus on survival, limitation, and the inevitability of endings. Even their most famous hero, Gilgamesh, does not conquer death. He learns that endurance is not the same as permanence. That lesson echoes through their entire culture. If human history restarted with the Sumerians, then they were the first to understand that civilization is not guaranteed. It must be constantly rebuilt. And rebuilding does not erase the memory of collapse. It carries it forward. This makes the Sumerians less like our ancestors and more like our mirrors. We too inherit systems we did not create. Measurement standards, legal frameworks, technologies whose inner workings few truly understand. We maintain them because they work, not because we grasp their origins. Our world, like theirs, rests on layers of accumulated knowledge that could be lost faster than we expect. And just as the Sumerians aligned themselves with the sky for stability, we align ourselves with systems we trust to endure. But trust is not the same as permanence, because once catastrophe interrupts continuity, the story resets. Not completely, never completely. Enough survives to rebuild, but never enough to remember everything. That may be the quiet lesson embedded in Sumerian civilization. They did not see themselves as the first. They saw themselves as the ones who came after the flood, after the loss, after something that could not be fully recovered. Their role was not to begin history, but to carry it forward as carefully as possible, and that reframes our place in the story. If history can restart, then we are not standing at the end of a long, uninterrupted line. We are standing somewhere within a cycle, beneficiaries of continuity that may not last, caretakers of systems that future generations may inherit without context. The Sumerians left us no clear answers about what came before them, but they left us something more valuable, a warning written quietly into clay. Civilization is not permanent. Memory is fragile. Continuity is earned, not guaranteed. And if we are listening closely, their message is not about the past at all, it is about the future. What if the Sumerians were trying to leave a message rather than an explanation? What if the true purpose of their records was not to tell us where we came from, but to warn us about how easily everything can be lost? Clay tablets are an unusual choice for preserving memory. They are heavy, fragile when wet, and difficult to transport. And yet, once fired, whether intentionally or by accident, they become remarkably durable. Fires that destroy wooden shelves harden clay instead of erasing it. Floods that collapse buildings bury tablets intact beneath protective layers of mud. Time itself becomes less destructive to clay than to almost any other medium. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote their most important records not on papyrus or parchment, but in clay. Administrative texts, legal decisions, astronomical observations, hymns, king lists. These were not meant to be ephemeral. They were meant to survive disaster. And survival implies expectation. You do not design records for endurance unless you believe endurance will be tested. Across Sumerian cities, archaeologists have uncovered libraries deliberately stored in ways that protected their contents, tablets stacked carefully, catalogued, sometimes sealed within collapsed rooms that preserved them for millennia. This was not accidental archiving, it was intentional memory management. And memory management is a response to fragility. The Sumerians understood that cities fall. They understood that floods come. They understood that political order dissolves. Their solution was not to prevent collapse, that was beyond their control, but to preserve enough information that rebuilding would be possible afterward. This perspective casts their civilization in a different light. Rather than chasing expansion or domination, they focused on continuity. Laws needed to be written down so disputes could be resolved consistently, even if leadership changed. Calendars needed to be fixed so seasons could be anticipated even if oral traditions failed. Astronomical records needed to persist so time itself would not drift into confusion. And once again, this does not look like the behavior of a culture discovering these systems for the first time. It looks like the behavior of a culture that knows what happens when such systems disappear. Consider how rarely Sumerian texts boast. There is no triumphal narrative declaring the dawn of civilization. Instead, their inscriptions emphasize duty, restoration, maintenance, carrying forward what was established in distant days. Even kings present themselves as restorers rather than originators. That language suggests restraint born of experience. It also suggests that catastrophe had already taught them something profound, that no matter how advanced a society becomes, its survival depends on transmission. Knowledge must be passed on deliberately, redundantly, and in forms resilient to chaos. This is why Sumerian knowledge feels compressed, dense, efficient. They were not expanding endlessly. They were packing what mattered into durable form. When viewed through this lens, the Sumerian world feels haunted by awareness. An awareness that the past had ended abruptly. An awareness that the future could do the same. Their civilization exists in the space between loss and hope. And this awareness may explain why their worldview places such emphasis on balance, between order and chaos, between human effort and cosmic forces, between memory and forgetting. Their gods are not saviors, they are administrators trying to keep a complex system from unraveling. Even their flood stories reflect this tension. The flood is not described as a punishment for moral failure alone. It is described as an overwhelming force that disrupts order itself. Noise, overpopulation, imbalance. The gods regret their decision afterward. They learn from it. They impose limits. This is not moral absolutism. It is systemic correction. Once again, this sounds less like pure myth and more like reflection on catastrophe, and reflection implies hindsight. If the Sumerians were preserving memory rather than inventing history, then their message may not be about who ruled before the flood or how long they lived. It may be about what happens when complexity grows faster than resilience, when systems become too interconnected to fail gracefully. Their records do not shout this warning. They whisper it. Through meticulous detail, through repetition, through an almost obsessive concern with order, because once you lose everything once, you stop assuming it cannot happen again. This brings the Sumerian story uncomfortably close to our own moment. We live in a world of immense complexity. Global systems intertwined, technologies layered upon technologies, knowledge specialized to the point that no individual can grasp more than a fraction of what sustains daily life. Like the Sumerians, we rely on inherited systems we did not design. And like them, we assume continuity. But continuity is not guaranteed. It is maintained, actively, relentlessly. And when maintenance fails, collapse does not announce itself. It arrives quietly. Infrastructure erodes, knowledge fragments, memory compresses. The Sumerians may have been the first to understand this truth deeply enough to act on it, to embed memory into material that could outlast disaster, to accept that civilization might restart again and again, carried forward by fragments and caretakers rather than founders. If that is the case, then their legacy is not a mystery about gods or lost worlds. It is a lesson about responsibility. They were not trying to preserve the past for curiosity's sake. They were preserving it because they believed someone would need it again. And perhaps they were right, because if history truly restarted with the Sumerians, then it did so quietly, without ceremony, without awareness. And those who came after mistook survival for origin, which leaves us with one final question. If a future civilization were to uncover the remnants of our world, what fragments would survive? And what story would they tell? What if the true legacy of the Sumerians is not what they knew, but what they feared losing? What if everything they built was shaped by the awareness that continuity is fragile? When we look back at early civilizations, it is tempting to measure them by what they achieved. Cities, writing, law, astronomy. But achievement alone does not explain behavior. Motivation does. And the Sumerians behave like a culture that understood something most societies prefer to ignore. They understood that civilization can end. Not slowly, not politely, but suddenly. Through forces beyond negotiation, floods, environmental shifts, social breakdown. The ground beneath their cities quite literally recorded this lesson in clay and silt, and once learned, it could not be forgotten. This awareness may explain why Sumerian civilization feels unusually sober. There is little triumphalism in their texts, little emphasis on destiny or eternal dominance. Instead, there is a constant effort to stabilize, to regulate, to align human systems with forces larger than human control. Their laws seek balance rather than perfection. Their myths acknowledge limits rather than promise salvation. Their kingship is conditional, bound by decrees older than any ruler. This is not the mindset of a civilization convinced of its invincibility. It is the mindset of one that has seen what happens when order collapses. Even their understanding of humanity reflects this tension. Humans are not portrayed as masters of the world, nor as central to cosmic purpose. They are workers, caretakers, participants in a larger system that must be maintained. This perspective does not flatter humanity, but it does place responsibility squarely on human action. Responsibility implies consequence. If humans fail to maintain balance, the system destabilizes. If noise grows too loud, if labor becomes unsustainable, if resources are mismanaged, the myths suggest that collapse follows not because of moral failure alone, but because of systemic overload. This framing feels strikingly modern. We often imagine ancient societies as naive or overly symbolic, but the Sumerians appear acutely aware of feedback loops, of thresholds, of tipping points. Their gods argue because the system is complex. Their solutions involve limits, redistribution, correction. These are not divine whims. They are responses to imbalance, and imbalance is what precedes collapse. If we read Sumerian civilization through this lens, their obsession with record-keeping becomes less about administration and more about resilience. Records allow systems to be recalibrated. They preserve institutional memory beyond individual lifespans. They enable recovery after disruption. This is why clay matters. Clay does not merely store information. It anchors it. It forces decisions to be made explicit, boundaries written down, measures standardized, agreements fixed. In a world where oral tradition can drift and fragment, writing becomes a defense against entropy. The Sumerians embraced this defense early, perhaps earlier than anyone else because they understood the cost of forgetting. This may also explain why their civilization seems to arrive already burdened with gravity. There is no sense of innocence, no narrative of discovery untainted by loss. Instead, there is caution, reverence, a quiet insistence on doing things the right way because the wrong way has already been tried and failed. If this interpretation is even partially accurate, then the Sumerians were not merely preserving knowledge, they were preserving warnings, encoded in procedures, embedded in stories, reinforced through ritual, a message carried forward not as prophecy, but as habit. Habits are powerful carriers of memory. You do not need to remember why a habit exists for it to shape behavior. Over time, habits become culture. Culture becomes identity, and identity persists long after explanation fades. The Sumerians may have been shaped by habits born of catastrophe, habits of caution, of measurement, of alignment, of maintenance. These habits made their civilization resilient enough to endure, even as memory of the original collapse faded into myth. But resilience is not permanence. Eventually, Sumerian civilization itself fragmented. Languages shifted, power moved, new empires rose. The caretakers became ancestors. Their systems were absorbed, modified, and partially forgotten, and yet fragments survived. Their mathematics still structures our clocks. Their divisions still shape our maps. Their warnings still echo quietly beneath our assumptions of progress. Because once you accept that history can restart, you begin to see the present differently. You stop assuming inevitability. You recognize fragility. You understand that complexity must be tended, not trusted, and that knowledge preserved without understanding can survive, but it can also mislead if treated as eternal. The Sumerians may have known this too. They preserved what they could, knowing it would not be enough to prevent future collapse, but hoping it would be enough to allow rebuilding. Again, and that may be the most human act of all. Not certainty, not mastery, but care. Care for a world that has already failed once. Care for memory that could be lost again. Care for continuity, even when permanence is impossible. Which leaves us with a final, unsettling reflection. If the Sumerians were right, then history does not belong to those who begin civilizations, but to those who preserve them through collapse. And that means the most important question is no longer about the distant past. It is about who is preserving memory now. What if the quietest civilizations leave the longest echoes? What if the Sumerians understood that survival does not depend on being remembered, but on being useful to the future? Most civilizations try to be seen. They build monuments meant to dominate landscapes and memory. They carve their victories into stone, proclaiming permanence. The Sumerians did build monuments, but their true legacy was not vertical. It was archival. It lay flat, pressed into clay, hidden beneath floors and collapsed walls, waiting rather than demanding attention. That choice reveals something profound. They were not trying to impress the future. They were trying to reach it. Clay tablets do not inspire awe at first glance. They are small, dense, quiet. They require patience, and patience suggests intent. A message meant for someone who is willing to listen slowly, someone who understands that meaning unfolds over time, not at first contact. This may explain why so much of Sumerian knowledge feels understated. There are no grand declarations announcing the reset of history, no warnings written in large letters. Instead, there is consistency, the same phrases repeated across centuries, the same structures preserved across cities, the same insistence on accuracy, even when understanding had faded. This is how a culture speaks when it expects interruption. They did not assume their audience would be continuous. They assumed gaps, loss, rediscovery. Their message was not aimed at their contemporaries alone, but at whoever might come after, trying to rebuild sense from fragments. This perspective reframes their relationship with myth. Myth in Sumerian culture does not function as escapism. It functions as compression. When explanation becomes too complex or too dangerous to lose, it is encoded into story. Characters replace variables. Narratives replace equations. Memory survives because it is told, retold, and reshaped without losing its core structure. This is why Sumerian myths feel oddly technical beneath their symbolism. They preserve sequences, roles, dependencies, causes, and effects. They do not resolve cleanly because they were never meant to. They were meant to endure. Endurance requires flexibility. A story can survive when a formula cannot. A ritual can persist when instructions are forgotten. A symbol can carry meaning long after its origin dissolves. The Sumerians appear to have understood this intuitively. They layered their knowledge, some of it explicit, some of it symbolic, some of it procedural, each layer designed to survive different kinds of loss. And survival was not hypothetical to them. Their world had already been erased once, whether by flood, environmental shift, or cascading collapse. Something had ended decisively enough to fracture memory. The Sumerians lived with that awareness. They built with it, wrote with it, governed with it. That awareness is what makes their civilization feel heavy with restraint. They do not rush to explain the cosmos. They do not promise eternal order. They acknowledge limits. They record failures. They preserve what works. This is not the optimism of a beginning. It is the realism of a continuation. And continuation is quieter than origin. When we study Sumer today, we often search for answers. Who came before them? What knowledge did they inherit? What catastrophe reset the world? These are natural questions, but they may not be the questions the Sumerians cared most about. They may have cared more about what comes after. Their tablets suggest a civilization deeply concerned with continuity beyond individual lives, laws outlasting rulers, calendars outlasting generations, records outlasting memory. This is not vanity. It is responsibility. Responsibility to those who will rebuild. If human history restarted with the Sumerians, then they may have understood something that later civilizations forgot. That survival is not about dominance or expansion. It is about transmission. About ensuring that enough of the system remains intact for life to reorganize itself after disruption, and disruption they knew was inevitable. This understanding strips history of its comforting illusions. It replaces destiny with cycles, progress with maintenance, innovation with stewardship. It asks us to see civilization not as a ladder, but as a relay. Each generation carries what it can. Some drop the baton, some pass it cleanly, some stumble but keep moving. What matters is not how far one runner goes, but whether the baton survives. The Sumerians appear to have been runners who understood this deeply. They carried forward fragments of a world already lost. They stabilized it long enough for others to inherit, and they left behind records that would wait thousands of years to be read by people, asking the same questions they once asked themselves. Where did we come from? What was lost? And how do we keep it from happening again? If their message reaches us now, it is not because they shouted. It is because they prepared for silence, and perhaps that is the most enduring form of communication there is. What if the reason the Sumerians still matter is because their world feels uncomfortably familiar? What if the questions they were trying to preserve are the same ones we are struggling to ask? When modern scholars study Sumer, there is often a quiet disconnect. We analyze their tools, translate their texts, categorize their gods. But rarely do we sit with the emotional posture of their civilization. Rarely do we ask how it felt to build a world knowing another one had already failed. And yet that posture echoes through everything they left behind. The Sumerians lived with an awareness that order is temporary. Their myths do not promise salvation. Their heroes do not escape mortality. Their gods themselves are bound by systems they must manage rather than command absolutely. This worldview is not pessimistic. It is realistic. It accepts limits rather than denying them. That realism may be the true inheritance they left us, because our world, like theirs, is built on systems of staggering complexity. Energy grids, food networks, financial abstractions, digital memory. Each layer depends on countless others, functioning in synchrony. Like the Sumerians, we rely on continuity more than we realize, and like them, we assume tomorrow will resemble today. Until it doesn't. The Sumerians knew that resemblance could break. They knew that floods do not negotiate, that climates shift, that societies can become too loud, too strained, too imbalanced to sustain themselves. Their myths describe this not as moral failure alone, but as systemic overload. A world pushed beyond what its structures can hold. This framing matters because it removes the comfort of blame. Collapse is not always the result of villains or mistakes. Sometimes it is the result of success carried too far. Growth without recalibration. Complexity without resilience. If that sounds familiar, it should. The Sumerians responded to this awareness not with despair, but with discipline. They measured carefully, recorded obsessively, repeated rituals that anchored time. They built redundancy into memory, multiple copies, multiple cities, multiple layers of transmission. They understood something subtle and powerful, that the goal is not to prevent collapse entirely. It is to ensure that when collapse comes, enough survives to rebuild meaningfully. This may be why their civilization feels so focused on structure. Not structure as rigidity, but structure as scaffolding. A framework sturdy enough to endure shock, flexible enough to be reassembled, humble enough to accept impermanence. When viewed this way, Sumerian civilization is not ancient in spirit. It is modern, perhaps uncomfortably so. We too are surrounded by warnings we struggle to interpret. Data without context, systems without transparency, technologies maintained by specialists few understand. Like the Sumerians, we preserve because it works, not because we fully grasp why. And like them, we assume continuity will hold. But continuity is always provisional. The Sumerians did not know what caused the world before them to end. Or if they did, they no longer trusted that knowledge enough to explain it confidently. What they trusted was repetition, measurement, alignment, memory embedded into durable form. They trusted that someone someday would need what they preserved. And here we are, thousands of years later, reading their tablets, walking their ruins, asking questions they once asked themselves, not because they predicted us, but because they anticipated interruption. That anticipation may be the quiet core of their legacy. They were not trying to dominate the future. They were trying to leave it options. Options matter after collapse. They allow societies to choose paths rather than start from nothing. They preserve dignity. They shorten recovery. They keep humanity from repeating its most painful lessons blindly. If human history restarted with the Sumerians, then they were the first to understand that restarts are possible. And that understanding changed how they lived. They did not treat civilization as destiny. They treated it as responsibility. And responsibility does not end when one generation does. It extends forward, carried by records, habits, and structures that whisper across time, not telling future listeners what to believe, but offering them tools to think. The Sumerians may never have imagined the world we live in today, but they understood something essential about worlds in general. They end, they restart, and what survives matters more than how impressive it once was. That is not a message carved in stone. It is pressed quietly into clay, waiting. What if the greatest mistake we make when studying the Sumerians is assuming they were trying to explain the past? What if they were actually trying to stabilize the future? There is a subtle difference between explanation and preparation. Explanation seeks closure. It tells a story so it can be finished, categorized, and set aside. Preparation does the opposite. It leaves things open. It avoids certainty. It accepts that conditions will change and that whoever comes next will need room to adapt. The Sumerians seem to have chosen preparation. They did not leave behind a single unified narrative about humanity's origin. They left fragments, lists, records, cycles, stories that overlap without fully agreeing. This inconsistency is often treated as a flaw, something scholars attempt to reconcile. But inconsistency can be intentional. It can preserve flexibility. It can prevent dogma. A rigid explanation breaks when circumstances change. A flexible framework survives. This may be why Sumerian civilization feels incomplete rather than definitive. Their texts rarely insist. They suggest. They record. They repeat. They allow space for interpretation without collapsing into chaos. Their worldview accepts that not everything can be known and that pretending otherwise invites disaster. That restraint may be the most advanced feature of their culture, because certainty is brittle. Civilizations that believe their systems are final tend to overextend them. They confuse success with permanence. They mistake continuity for inevitability. The Sumerians, shaped by memory of collapse, never appear to make that mistake. Their systems are designed to function, not to impress. Their records are meant to endure, not to dominate. And endurance requires humility. Humility to accept limits. Humility to preserve what works rather than chase novelty. Humility to admit that knowledge can be lost and that the future may not resemble the present. If human history truly restarted with the Sumerians, then they may have been the first to internalize this lesson fully, not as philosophy, but as practice. They embedded it into how they measured time, how they wrote laws, how they told stories, and how they archived memory. They treated civilization not as an achievement to be celebrated, but as a condition to be maintained. That framing changes everything. It suggests that the most important civilizations are not those that conquer the most territory or build the tallest monuments, but those that preserve coherence under pressure, those that plan not just for success, but for interruption, those that accept that history can fracture and design systems accordingly. The Sumerians may have been such a civilization. Their cities eventually fell, their language faded, their gods were renamed, but their structures endured. Their measurements still organize our days, their divisions still shape our maps, their warnings still echo quietly beneath our confidence, not because they were right about everything, but because they understood something essential. Civilization is not self-sustaining. It survives only as long as people choose to preserve memory, maintain balance, and respect limits. When those choices fail, collapse follows. And when collapse follows, only fragments remain. The Sumerians chose their fragments carefully. They left behind tools rather than doctrines, records rather than commandments, frameworks rather than conclusions. They trusted that whoever found them next would need freedom to rebuild differently, under conditions they could not foresee. And perhaps that is why their civilization still speaks to us now. We live at a moment when continuity feels assumed, yet fragile, when complexity accelerates faster than understanding, when systems expand faster than resilience. Like the Sumerians, we stand on inherited structures we did not design, trusting that they will hold. The Sumerians would likely recognize this moment, not as unprecedented, but as familiar. And if their experience teaches us anything, it is this: history does not end, it restarts, quietly, unevenly, with fragments. What matters is not whether collapse can be avoided forever, it is whether enough survives to make rebuilding possible. That may be the real message pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, not a claim about gods or lost worlds, but a reminder about responsibility, because one day, someone may stand among the remains of our civilization, asking where history truly began, and what they find will depend on what we chose to preserve. What if the reason the Sumerians never gave us a clear ending is because they understood that endings are never clean? What if history does not conclude? It only pauses, waiting for someone else to continue the work. When we look for closure in the past, we often project our own needs onto it. We want beginnings to be clear, causes to be identifiable, and endings to feel definitive. But the Sumerians left us none of that. They did not mark the end of what came before them with certainty, nor did they declare themselves the true beginning of anything. Instead, they stood in the middle. They lived between a world they no longer fully remembered and a future they could not predict. Their records reflect that position: careful, fragmented, incomplete by design. They preserved what functioned, not what flattered them. They left room for correction rather than insisting on authority. This may be why their civilization feels so strangely modern, not because of what they knew, but because of how they related to uncertainty. The Sumerians did not try to control the story of humanity. They tried to stabilize it. They accepted that memory fades, that systems break, that catastrophe interrupts continuity. And instead of denying those realities, they built around them. They wrote in clay because clay survives disaster. They standardized time because time drifts when memory breaks. They embedded knowledge into ritual because stories outlast explanations. Every choice reflects preparation rather than confidence. If human history restarted with the Sumerians, then they may have been the first to understand something deeply unsettling. That civilization is not a permanent state. It is a temporary arrangement between order and chaos, and that arrangement must be renewed continuously, or it fails. This understanding does not produce triumph. It produces caution. It produces a culture that measures carefully, repeats deliberately, and resists the illusion of finality. A culture that sees itself not as the author of history, but as one of its many custodians. That custodianship is their true legacy. They did not leave us answers carved in stone. They left us systems that still function, measurements that still align, questions that still resonate. Their survival across thousands of years was not accidental. It was the result of choices made by people who believed interruption was inevitable, and perhaps that belief was the most valuable knowledge of all, because if history truly restarts, it does so quietly, without announcement, without recognition. Those living through it rarely know they are standing at the threshold between before and after. Only later does the rupture become clear. The Sumerians may have known this, and so they prepared not for recognition, but for rediscovery. They trusted that someone somewhere in a distant future would need what they preserved, not to admire them, not to worship them, but to rebuild understanding when continuity fractured again. That is why their legacy does not demand belief. It invites reflection. It asks us to consider not whether they were right about the past, but whether they were right about fragility, about cycles, about the responsibility each civilization carries toward those who will inherit its remains. If history restarted once, it can restart again. And when it does, what survives will not be the tallest monuments or the loudest declarations. It will be the quiet structures that still work, the habits that still guide, the records that still make sense when everything else has fallen away. That is what the Sumerians left behind. Not a story with an ending, but a pause, waiting for the next hand to pick up the thread.